Welcome to another Story Corner. I'm back to telling stories. I'm going to leave poetry to the professionals. This is one of our shared stories with our cousins over the war. Scotland and Ireland share much in the way of history, culture and language. You know, the greatest Gaelic heroes straddle the Irish Sea, but in many ways Scotland's lost some of its connection to those stories. These are so old that there are dozens of different versions, some with alternate characters, different motives, different places. So rather than filling this story with disclaimers, I'm just going to stick with the first version that I heard. If your granny told you a different version that took place in a different part of the world, don't worry, it's no less valid than the one that I'm about to tell. So Fionn McCool, otherwise known in Scotland as Fingal, was the leader of a legendary group of warriors that roamed the Gaelic world. His exploits have been passed down in poems and songs, not to forget his faithful dog Bran. But this story isn't really about Fingal. It's not about Bran either. It's actually about his nephew, Dermot. You see, Dermot was almost as great a warrior as Fingal, and his obvious second in command. But he was also devilishly handsome. Even had a birthmark on the side of his head. The mere sight of it would make any woman fall madly in love with him. The young man had a sense of honour to go along with his strength and his looks, so he kept his magic mark hidden under a helmet at all times. He definitely didn't want the extra female attention at Fingal's wedding. Fingal was getting married to a beautiful young bride, Grainne. The wedding celebrations lasted for days. Music, dancing, feasting, more importantly, drinking, all in full flow. Everything was going well until somebody let the hunting dogs in. Suddenly, the hounds were causing a scene, fighting over this feast all around him. Brave Dermot waded in. He was the man to separate them. These weren't meek little puppies though. In the struggle to bring them to heel, Dermot's helmet was knocked off his head. And the way that Grainne was staring at Dermot, standing in the middle of all the carnage, it was pretty obvious she had caught sight of his magical mark. And as much as he tried to avoid his uncle's bride over the next few days, Grainne just kept finding ways to bump into him. Dermot tried his best, but in the end he couldn't deny it any longer. He was in love with Grainne, and he was struggling to put off her advances. His only option was to pack up his things and flee into the night, finding his way to an isolated bothy in the hills. Just when he thought he was safe, he had a light tapping at the door. Somehow Grainne had followed him, alone with the most beautiful woman in the world. Dermot didn't stand a chance. He gave in to his urges and accepted he was going to be living a life on the run. And the next morning the lovers fled across the water to Kintyre. They moved from place to place, further inland, until they finally felt safe, hidden in Glenshee. Fingal was equally devastated and furious. Not only had he lost his beautiful bride, but his nephew and friend as well. He could have sent his warriors after the pair and hunted them down, but Fingal just couldn't do it. As long as the runaways were out of sight, they were out of mind. Fingal could get on with his life and start to heal the hole in his heart. But then, he travelled to Scotland to hunt a legendary boar, and that boar was prowling around Glenshee. Inevitably, Fingal and Dermot came face to face. A cold sweat must have trickled down Dermot's back at the same time as a searing rage came over Fingal. They were still family though. He couldn't bring himself to kill his nephew in cold blood. Instead, Fingal issued Dermot a challenge to take on this legendary boar single-handedly. Secretly, he was hoping the boar would have taken care of his nephew and his conscience would be clear. This was no little pig though. This boar was bigger than Dermot, with long sharp tusks and a back covered in spines. The battle was fierce. Hunting dogs were no match for the beast. They charged straight for Dermot himself. Huge chunks of earth are churned out the ground as the boar came thundering at the hunter, with his life on the line and a monster bearing down at him. Dermot didn't flinch. He levelled his spear, stared straight in the boar's eyes and struck true. Down the monster fell, sliding to a stop at Dermot's feet. Fingal wasn't happy. He couldn't just walk away now that he was face to face with a couple. Then he remembered that the bristles on that boar's back were poisonous. Dermot probably had no idea. called out to his nephew to measure out just how big this gigantic boar really was. Up the young man hopped, walking along the boar's back from snout to tail, calling out how many paces as he went. Fingal snorted. There's no way it was as large as that. Measure it again. As Dermot turned, counted out the paces on the way back, one of those poisonous bristles sunk deep into his foot. There was no joy in Fingal's eyes as he watched his nephew suffering. Just the look of a man wrestling with his guilt. He couldn't take it anymore. Fingal had his own magical gift, that any wound could be healed by drinking from his cupped hands. He raced to a burn, filling his hands with water, and he hurried back to his nephew. But it was too late. By the time he arrived, Dermot had taken his last breath. And no amount of magical water could bring him back or wash away Fingal's guilt. Dermot was buried in Glen Shee. His grave is still there, marked by 4 huge boulders. They frame the spot on the hill where he fell. I hope you enjoyed that story. Like I said, it's a story that's told in Ireland as well as Scotland, but in different places with some slightly different series of events. It's fairly tragic and heartbreaking, and if we're honest, I don't think any of the characters come out of it fairly well. But I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless, and I should have another one for you next week. Slash.